Can you hear me, PSC?
Yes, sir. You are audible.
Okay, thank God. Problems
here.
Yeah.
We are recording the meeting, so if some of you, and especially our speakers for the evening, if they can switch on their videos, it will be good. A warm welcome to Dr. Nishi Pulgorta, and sir, if you could, yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'll make the opening statements maybe. First of all, welcome all of you present, and in advance, welcome also those who are joining in right now. It gives us immense pleasure to be able to welcome all of you to this very special event today, right at the end of the year. This is the second session or the second edition of a series of lectures that we hold at DESNU. DESNU, incidentally, is Department of English, Sister Nivedita University, for anyone who doesn't know about it as yet. And this series is called Literature Talks. And obviously, you see, there's a double meaning on talks, because these are talks on literature and talks on literature, about literature, and talks of literature. The point of these lectures is to focus on areas which are slightly out of the ordinary, issues that are rather new, and the concepts that are emerging and are cutting edge right at this moment. And this time, as you all know, we have a pair of such concepts, the concepts being text and paratext. And we have two very special people both to me personally as well as to DESNU with us tonight. We have Professor Dr. Nishi Pulgorta, who my head of the department, of DESNU, Professor Dr. Probal Roy Chaudhary, is going to introduce in a few seconds' time. And we also have our former head of the department of DESNU, Dr. Madhuchanda Roy Chaudhary. And between us, they would be illuminating us, giving us information about the concepts that we're going to talk about today. That is, on the one hand, text, and on the other, paratext. And may I once again say a very warm welcome to everyone here. And thank you, Nishi, not formally, but just, personally, for being with us. And obviously, thank you, MRC, Madhuchanda Roy Chaudhary, as usual. And now for the formal inauguration, the introductions, and all the rest of the rather important rituals that we have to perform before we enter into a serious session of academic discussion. I hand over to the head of the department of DESNU, Professor Dr. Probal Roy Chaudhary. Professor Roy Chaudhary, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Dhar. And you see, I feel very happy that we are going to close the year on an interesting note, on a note which will be intellectually stimulating for all of us. And we'll be closing the year on a learning note. And that will also allow us to start the new year again on a learning note. Now, this is the second edition, as Professor Dhar pointed out, this is the second edition of our literature talks. And this time the theme is texts and paratexts, and we have two scholars with us who will be holding forth and sharing their views on texts and paratexts with us today. So we will have the session in this manner. First, we will have Dr. Nishi Pulgorta speaking to us, and this will be followed by Dr. Madhuchanda Roy Chaudhary. After both the speakers have shared their views with us, we will have a question answer session from the side of the audience. And after the question answer session, we will end the program formally. So before we begin the formal program, I would like to, as the head of the department, I would like to formally welcome all our guests today, all our students, dear students, and especially Dr. Nishi Pulgorta, and obviously our very own MRC, Dr. Madhuchandra Roy Chaudhary. And it's the year-end time. Everybody is busy, but they have still found out time. Giving a talk is not that easy. You have to prepare. You have to spend time on it. You have to go through the books. However much you would have read on the subject, but you always need to prepare before you deliver something. And all that they have been able to do at this, it's a bit of challenging times also with COVID infections on the rise and all that. So without much more words, I would like to again welcome Dr. Nishi Pulgorta and informally introduce her to all of you. She is an associate professor with the Department of English at Brahmananda Keshav Chandra College in Kolkata. Her areas of interest are British Romantic literature, Indian writing in English, the diaspora, and Shakespeare adaptations in film. Dr. Pulgorta has published in referred and international and national journals, in the Coleridge Bulletin, in the Encyclopedia of Postcolonial Studies, published from Blackwell, in the Shakespeare and Indian Cinemas Local Habitations, which is an edited volume published from Routledge, London in 2019. Also in the Cambridge Companion to British Romanticism and Religion, which was published earlier this year. She also has a monograph on Derozio and a collection of travel essays titled Out in the Open, an edited volume of essays on travel, which is titled Across and Beyond, and a volume of poems, The Real and the Unreal and Other Poems. The last two volumes were published in 2020. She also has authored a collection of short stories. This was published under the title The Windowsill, again this year. So you see, she is not only a scholar, but she is a prolific writer who has written essays, poems, and edited volumes, besides writing scholarly papers. She has also edited a special issue of Café Dissensus on epidemics, pandemics, and literature, something very interesting and relevant to our times. It was published in February 2021, and a special feature issue of Muse India on Shakespeare in Indian cinema, which was also published earlier this words. With these words, I would like to again welcome Dr. Nishi Pulgorta and request her to offer her address. Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Dr. Roy Chaudhary. Thank you to Professor Shubir Da, for asking me to be part of this event, and to Moni Kinkini, who got in touch with me initially. And as Professor Roy Chaudhary has been saying, this is the end of the year. We're all caught up in various kinds of things, and it was a bit difficult to say yes to this. But I thought I would, take it up and set to work on it. Though what I'm going to talk about today predominantly, I wouldn't style it a talk, but I would like to speak of it as a kind of my ruminations or observations on text. And I will be also referring to my own, the way in which I have worked with certain things that I have written over the period of time. So they are more in the nature of observations and ruminations, and I'm more than willing to, initially I'm very much interested in actually listening to what Madhuchandra has to say about Paratexts, because as I was preparing for this particular event, I came across a number of important and very interesting ideas which the Paratext involves. And I'm very, very keen, not just as an academic, but also as someone who writes short stories and other genres. I'm very interested in the way the Paratext features. So I would begin by talking about the very idea of the word text, the very word text, because I found that very interesting when I set out, as Professor Roy Chaudhary said, it does involve a lot of work preparing for an event like this. And as I was working through various texts and various works, the first thing that struck me most is the very word text, which comes from the Latin word texere. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Texcre, which means to weave. And this very meaning of this word is something that struck me most, because I think, when I am working with words, when I am working to write something, it is this weaving that I am doing without being very, very conscious about it. And the moment I was thinking about the idea of weave, the idea of textiles comes in. And as I was reading up, one of the things that I found is that this particular word text has its origins in Quintilian's Institutio Horatia, where he writes that after you have chosen your words, and I'm quoting from the text, they must be woven together into a fine and delicate fabric. And what is interesting is the Latin word for fabric being textum. So just as when a weaver is weaving together a piece of cloth, we have the warp and the weft, and both of which are very, very important. And as the spindle moves across, we have the fabric slowly coming forth. Similarly, a text is a human product, I would say, whose form is kind of achieved by the author's design and its meanings by the author's intentional use of words, intentional uses of the verbal medium. So that, I think, would be my warp and weft as I sit down to write whatever genre I am writing. So, and as I was looking up, when I am working at it, I'm not so much bothered about the word text. But as I sat down to kind of bring my observations about this particular idea into a concrete form, I was wondering about how, when one sits to write, one is, of course, there is this design, there is the framework which I have in mind when I sit down to write, and the kind of words that I use in order to put my thought, in order to put my ideas into a perfect kind of a form, or into a form which I think would be best expressive of whatever I want to convey. And obviously, when one is talking about the word text, we will be talking about, notions of the work and text come in, and Roland Barthes does come in very, very strongly. But I don't want to use the distinction that Barthes used of work and text, because I would rather like to, pick them up as synonymous, or as a kind of a synonymous use. I'm not going to differentiate between the work and the text in the way that Barthes does, because I think that when I am writing, I am, for me, the work and the text is kind of the same. Unlike for Barthes, who says that the work is a concrete object, something that is definite and complete. Whereas when he's talking about the text, he is talking about something where the text is a composition, or the meaning the reader takes from the work, the fact that it is not a definite object that he says. But this is not the meaning that I am going to take up when I am talking about the text this evening. I'm going to use I'm going to use the word text definitely, but I am going to not use the kind of distinction that Barthes makes. For me, the text is something that contains meaning, which is, of course, open to interpretation. Whoever reads my work, or attempts to read my work, or decides to read my work, looks at certain things from a different perspective. And very recently, one of my poems appeared in a special issue of Café des Censors on this was a special issue on the city, poems which expressed, which looked at the city. And I wrote about the city that I live in, Kolkata, and about my way in which I have been trying to rediscover the city, primarily by walking through the lanes of the city, looking at buildings, and trying to kind of find the way things were. And that is what I wrote in this particular poem. It's a short poem. However, when a former student very recently, a couple of days ago, messaged saying that he'd read the poem and that he found touches of de la Mer, which never struck me, because he told me that he found certain Gothic elements in the poem, which is something that I did not, after he told me, I went back to the poem and I was wondering as to where he got this particular idea. So when I look at a text, I am thinking of something which is absolutely open to interpretation. So it is the reader, it is my reader who is toying with the book, who is dealing with whatever I am writing and trying to find means. So a text, therefore, to me is anything that conveys a set of meanings to the person who is examining them. Of course, in today's world, texts are not just limited to written materials such as books or magazines, or we have now e-zines, and there are movies and paintings, television shows, songs, political cartoons, even memes, advertisements. Almost everything has layers of meaning, has layers of intertextuality, layers of information that we are looking at, that we are dealing with. And that is what I thought when my student spoke to me about this particular poem. He had a very long message. And he asked me if I had that in mind when I was writing this poem, which I did not. I mean, it never struck me that I was writing about something Gothic, because I was talking about my city and the buildings in my city, which I think tell stories to me. And as I was thinking about this idea of the story, I was thinking of the fact that, even before we had texts, even before we had texts that we read, we had stories. And I think it is this idea of stories, it is this idea of storytelling, which is a communal act, a retelling of daily life, presenting vignettes, maybe just entertaining, a communal way of sharing things, a communal way of being connected. And I think it is through that the idea of language and spoken word kind of came together, found power. And as I was thinking about this idea, I was also thinking about cave drawings, stone carvings. I think these two are very important ideas of text, important examples of writing, either on stone or impressed on barks, which went on to record numbers, which went on to speak about lists, which went on to convey information. And as I was thinking about all of this, I was thinking that I would talk a little bit about the kind of work that I have been doing, which I think is my way of looking at the text. So as I was thinking about all of this, one of the first things that struck me is when as I've been talking about this, cave paintings, the stone carvings and so on, I was drawn to the idea of the fact that these early texts were illuminated manuscripts, and they had so much to convey. They help to depict a story, they help to enforce the importance of the message on the parchment or on the wall or on the cave. And I think this was the beginning of the picture book, which later on went on to be transcribed onto paper and went on to become what it is in today's world. Of course, today we have the e-form much in use. And I think the moment we move on to the e-form, there's a lot of change happening in the way in which we deal with these modern texts. The digital forms reveal a much more, they are a much more fluid kind of a work, as I feel. So as we as I talk about the fact that text is a form of communication, text conveys information and meaning, it also presents an opportunity for interpretation and artistic engagement. And whether as an academic or whether as an author, when I'm doing both, right? I'm engaging artistically on one level, and when I am dealing as an academic, I am looking forward to interpreting texts in certain ways. A common assumption, I think, about text, whether we are talking about plays or about works of philosophy or literature, is that they are primarily mental events which are reflected, presented in their material forms. I was thinking of a scenario where a writer may, in haste, put down a wrong word. A printer may misread the manuscript, or a censor may cut out sections of a book. And these acts work to corrupt the purity and integrity of the real text, if I could call it. And I think the very word real is a bit problematic as well, because there are times when I think what I want to say, or the way in which I'm saying certain things, are inadequate, and that words, the kind of words that come to mind when I'm writing, does not really convey the sense that I want to. I also think that such a view of the text accords primacy to writers and to their intentions, which, of course, readers should be able to access in the best way that they can in a meeting of minds. For instance, if one picks up a copy of a classic in a bookstore, the chances are that it has been edited with an eye, and I'm sure Madhuchanda will be talking more about it, with an eye to delivering the text as the author intended it, with nothing added and nothing possibly taken away. And I think in reality, texts are much more messier than this idea-centered account allows. The notion that any writer has a single, final kind of intention is not always true, because writers change their mind. Writers keep on revising their texts, responding to the unfolding of form of the works in unforeseen, unpredictable ways. One of my first books out in the open, which I self-published a couple of years ago, this is a collection of essays on travel, which were written over a long period of time, published in various places, in newspapers and so on. And when I sat down to work on this book, because I was self-publishing it, I got to work on it and arrange it as I thought would be adequate. I didn't have anyone helping me out or editing the whole thing. It was an entirely personal work. And as I sat down to kind of collate essays which I had written over a period of time, I found that I needed to make a lot of changes in the essays. So the versions of the essays that are published in the book are very different from the essays that were published, the first time. So it's a constantly evolving thing. And even now, I feel if I went back to working on those essays, if I go in for another edition, then I'm sure that I'm going to make further changes on that as well. There is a second example that I would like to talk about, and this is a forthcoming volume of poems called Raindrops on the Periwinkle, which is going to be published by Writers Workshop, Kolkata. And this is a volume of form poems which I wrote. And here as well, these were poems which were composed during the lockdown in 2020, and which spoke about my experience of being isolated, of being locked in, of physical isolation, of working from home, of my mother who had Alzheimer's. So all of these figure there. And here as well, what you get to read in the final form of the poems is just me working. And since I was writing form poems, I had to keep in mind a lot of other things. I had to keep in mind the the syllable count, the structure of the poem. So I was in control of everything that was happening here in this particular work. Of course, this is one experience of it, but writing at times is also a collaborative process, because it not just involves a writer who is dealing with the materials, with institutions, with ideas, with images, with concepts that help to give the text a presence in the world. So what I'm writing, my words, the words that my word processor may have a significant impact on the way the text develops, but also media, the institutions by which it circulates is also very, very important. And I think, when I am writing, and since I've been thinking about this for the past few days because of this event this evening, I think every text is a kind of a negotiation between the author, between the writer, and a welter of worldly circumstances. So the form definitely affects meaning. And this is something that I found holding out very true when I was writing these form poems. Also, in one of the works that Professor Roy Choudhury spoke about, the collection of short stories called The Window Sill, there the editor had a lot of things to say. So I had to kind of rearrange the stories, keeping in mind what the editor wanted. So there was a kind of a negotiation once again, trying to bring out this particular collection of short stories, and the kind of things that I had to keep in mind. So it is not just the stories which I wrote, but it was also the way in which I arranged the stories, which were written over a period of time, keeping in mind the public space in which the book would be available, keeping in mind what readers or how readers would be approaching the book, because I was told categorically that the first story and the last story have to be the best. So, and the moment the editor told me that, I realized that that's something that we often do, flip through and turn right to the end or right at the beginning. So I had to, I had arranged, when I sent in the manuscript, I had arranged the stories in one particular way, or I had some idea of in which I would arrange the stories, but I had to rearrange them, keeping in mind what the editor had to say. And I'm sure Madhu Chanda will add more to it when she talks more about the paratext, which I found to be a very, very interesting idea. And an idea which when we are working with text, we are not so much, concerned with or involved with. But as I began to sift through material to talk about things this evening, that is something that came into my mind. So text originally, text is something that comes into contention when the concept of literature was being expanded to include a lot of kinds of literature, trivial, essays, general, nonfiction, and when there is a growing interest in the phenomena of popular culture, I think. Because when I was working on the short story collection, I also had to work on the title, because the original title that I had in mind was not the title that the editor decided upon. This is not the title that I had thought upon. I had a different title in mind. And I had to go along with what the editor said, because he had something else in mind. And most importantly, he had the reader and I think more than the reader, also the way in which the work would be received outside. So the cultural world of readers, therefore, I think, when I think about all of these that I had to deal with in my course of work, I think the cultural world of readers not only determines what texts are to be read, what texts are deemed of value or included within the canon, how one needed to read canonical text or what they mean, but I think they also determine the meaning of text itself. And cultural readings, I think, are very much like culture. They're not static. They're always dynamic and always complex. So what I call a text, when I'm talking about this right now, I'm talking about a finished corpus of writing. I'm talking about a content enclosed in a book or its margins. But then I'm also aware of the fact that beyond this finished corpus of work, beyond this content enclosed in a book, within the margins, within the covers, there is also a differential network. There's also a fabric of traces that constantly refers endlessly to something other than itself, to something beyond what I have written, to other differential traces. So I think at times the text overruns all the limits assigned to it. And I think that happens the moment it comes out into the space of the reader. Because texts, I think, particularly more so in the modern days when we're talking about digital text as well, they are provisional, since the individual documents, and this happens more in the case of the digital text, participate in an extensive, perhaps in an infinite docuverse. So, for instance, if one looks up a kind of a website like Victorian Web, for instance, which is a networked electronic docuverse that uses search tools and links, which kind of traverse the supposed beginning, middle, and end of what in print would be physically discrete documents. And I think that is where what Madhuchanda would be saying would come in, because the paratext would become an important idea over there as well. Also, when I am dealing with the text, particularly from the point of view of a writer, I'm not just dealing with, so when I'm writing a collection of short stories, or when I'm bringing all my stories together into one work, I am not just writing the short stories, but I'm also providing a framing narrative in an, in the form of a foreword or in the form of an introduction. And of course, my one doesn't have a foreword. I have a small preface which I wrote. And I think that preface kind of frames the work that I'm doing. I didn't want to put in the preface because I did not want to explain as to why I was doing certain things, or explain why I wanted to bring this out into the public domain. But then this was something which the editor wanted. So therefore, here in this particular volume, there was a collaboration. And I think in spite of the collaboration, the hierarchical structure where the author remains privileged over the editor. As an insider, I think I still held more authority as to what would become a part of my text than the editor, who kind of lies outside the work, whose work lies on the outside of the work. This quotation by Carl Sagan is something that I found very interesting. He writes in Cosmos, and this is what he writes. He's, of course, talking of the book, and I would like to, replace that with the word text. What an astonishing thing a text is. It's a flat object made from a tree with flexible parts on which are imprinted lots of funny dark squiggles. But one glance at it and you're inside the mind of another person, maybe somebody dead for thousands of years. This particular quotation just talks of the physical book, not the digital one. And even today, I'm not very comfortable using the digital one, of course, though throughout the pandemic, I've been forced to use more of the PDF, more of the digital form. But what I like about this particular quotation is how he talks about how one enters into the mind of another person the moment one is reading the text. And I think that is something very, very important when we are talking about the text. Because the author, when the author is writing, the author, I mean, at least in my case, I don't have the reader in mind. The reader is not present in my mind when I'm talking about. But when the work comes out, because when I began writing, I never imagined I would bring them out in a collection. But I think the moment I do that, it leads out, it comes out into the public space, and the audience of the text becomes much more important. And it is this audience which becomes something very, very important in the way in which my text is received, in the way in which people react to it, and people find certain things that resonate to them. So I think, the primary function of the text, where it is the purveyor of meaning, where you have ideas, where you have images, various kinds of images coming out, which is something which is of predominance. So the text is the composition, the text is the meaning that the reader takes. It is something that the reader constantly tries to deal with. It is a social space almost, which involves language, which makes the reader kind of assume the position of a judge, of a master, of an analyst, of a confessor, of somebody who tries to decode meaning as he tries to work his way through. So I believe the work is complete, it's comprehensive. From the point of view of the author, there are no arbitrariness involved in the literary understanding or interpretation. And of course, the moment it lands up with the reader, I do understand that it is open to a lot of interpretations and ideas. And I think it encourages the reader to produce overlapping ideas and make association. And I think this ambiguity is something that causes it to be extremely symbolical. It does have a closure because I have formulated it to have a closure. It can be interpreted literally, it is explanatory, but then at times it can also be open-ended, has a multitude of associations, and is deeply symbolic accordingly, and therefore has a plurality of meaning. I began by talking about this idea of the text as a woven fabric. And I think with the idea of the woven fabric also come the idea of known codes that are assembled differently and maybe interwoven, maybe woven together with citations, with references, with echoes, with what is intertextual, in that it is the text between of another text. And I think it is these ideas which kind of narrow the distance between reading and writing by replacing the consumption of the text with the free play of collaborative reading. So when interacting with the text, I think the reader questions, the reader thinks about the writing instead of taking it for granted. And maybe that is the pleasure of reading. So it's a pleasure of going back to the work and reading it, interpreting it. So I would end by saying that a text is anything that can be interpreted, anything that can be considered more than the sum of its parts. And I think that is the reason why we go back to reading and working through these codes that are so very important in the construction of a text. Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt, sir. You are on mute.
Oh, thanks, Ashish. Thanks. That was wonderful hearing to you, ma'am. And I am already a lot of questions, ideas are churning in my head, and I reserved them for the question answer session. But before we go to the question answer session, there is we would like to hear Dr. Madhuchanda Raichodhuri's views, her take on paratexts. Now that we have wonderful, wonderful insights on texts from Dr. Nishi Pulgorta. But today, it's a destiny occasion, but it's a formal occasion, and it's a great pleasure and a personal privilege for me to introduce my dear colleague, Dr. Madhuchanda Raichodhuri, formally to you. As you all know, our dear MSc ma'am is an assistant professor in our department, but she was also the former head of the department. When I joined the department, she was my head. Okay, and she completed her education from St. Xavier's College and Jadavpur University, and she did her doctoral program from, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, US. Before joining Sister Nivedita University in 2019, she was an assistant professor at Amity University and also at St. Xavier's University in Kolkata. And in both the places, she has served as the head of the department. Her research interests include 18th century British novel, the Gothic, literature of the Augustan Age, monsters, and monstrosity. At SNU, she is currently teaching courses on 18th and early 19th century British literature, history of English literature, and both at the undergrad and postgrad levels. She also takes research methodology classes for our PhD scholars. While in the US, as a research scholar, she taught academic writing and a course on introduction to fiction to undergrad students. She has presented papers at several national and international conferences, and among her published articles, I would love to name three of them. One of them was titled Concal Reef or Skeleton, Reconfiguring Gothic Tropes in Rabindranath Tagore's Short Stories. This was published earlier this year in an international journal. And in 2019, she published on a paper in Asian Quarterly titled Using Technology to Fake Facts in Mermaids and Gulliver's Travels. And in 2015, she published on Gulliver's Voyages, Breed a Monster, analyzing the ramifications of 18th century's obsession with travel and monstrosity. Okay, with these words, we welcome you, MRC, and we request you to present your take on paratexts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I just have a couple of disclaimers and requests before I start. First of all, I will be presenting my slides, but I'm just asking my DESLI colleagues to alert me in case the slides get stuck. So I will obviously mention when I'm changing a slide. If you don't see it, please let me know so that hopefully we'll be able to fix the problem. And secondly, my talk will sort of take two parts. As you can understand, I'll be talking about paratext primarily with reference to Gerard Genette, who kind of came up with this idea. But his book is like really thick, so it's not possible to summarize Genette in this shorter time. So my approach would be to give a sort of general overview of the main ideas that he's talking about. And then in the second half, I'd be using some familiar texts to sort of talk about the implications and the ramifications of this idea of paratext that Gerard Genette is coming up with. So just give me a second while I try to present my slides. Okay, I'm sharing my screen, sir. Hopefully the slides will come up. Are the slides visible?
Yeah, they're visible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So I'm changing the slide now. Did it change?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so obviously I've named this talk Paratexts, the Whys and the Wherefores. So before I go to Jeanette, just a little bit of an introduction about this word para. So if you look at the dictionary, it would tell you that the word para comes from a Greek word, and it means, and I quote, at or to one side of, beside, or side by side. It also means beyond. Now, in his book, Paratexts, which was originally published in 1987 as Ulysses, and please pardon my pronunciation, I don't know any French. It was published originally in French in 1987. It was translated and published in English in 1997. Anyway, so Gerard Genet's book, The Paratexts, really deals with the ramifications of all these definitions of para and even tends to go beyond it in order for us to explore and explain the nuances of interpretation of a text and what happens when a text becomes a book. So just briefly to introduce Gerard Genet. Gerard Genet, as you can see the dates over there, and he was a French literary theorist. He was associated with the structuralist movement. And of course, I've listed some of his important works, out of which we will specifically be dealing with the last one, which I've highlighted. Now, so let's first understand what Gerard Genet means by paratext. So very simply put, paratexts are all those surrounding materials or surrounding aspects or ingredients, which, as he says, precisely in order to present the text in the usual sense of the verb, but also in the strongest sense, to make present, to ensure the text's presence in the world, its reception and consumption in the form of a book. So in other words, if when a writer is writing, whether it's a manuscript, when a writer is writing, there is that part where he is putting pen to paper, and then that material is going out either to a publisher, or even before the publishing industry came into being, there would be scribes who would copy. So in any case, that moment of transition, that introduces several other elements, which then becomes part of what is called the paratext, or what Gerard Genet is calling paratext. Now, of course, this is very simply put, but there are many ramifications. So I'm changing the slide now. So as Genet says, the paratext is a very undefined zone because it is a fringe zone. Why is it a fringe zone? Because it is, while it involves certain tangible elements, which I'll talk about in a minute, tangible elements meaning foreword, preface, notes, even the way the title page is designed. So these are tangible elements, but the importance of the paratext lies both in how these tangible elements affect the interpretation and the reading and the reception of the text. But between these tangible elements and the intangible element, which is how the reader is receiving the text, the paratext also inhabits this undefined zone. So as it says, a fringe of the printed text, which in reality controls one's whole reading of the text. And this is what I would demonstrate when I use the examples that I will eventually. This fringe is always a conveyor of a commentary that is authorial or more or less legitimated by the author, constitute a zone between the text and off text, a zone not only of transition, but also of transaction. So it's not just about the transformation of a manuscript into the form of a printed book. That is the transition part, but also the transaction. And in that transition, how is the text designed? How is it presented to the reader? And incidentally here, Jeanette warns us about the fact that illustrations are very much a part of the published text or the published book, but he, for brevity's sake, is sticking only to text, as he says, verbal or written. So it's a privileged place of a pragmatics and strategy of an influence on the public, an influence that, whether well or poorly understood and achieved, is at the service of better reception for the text and more pertinent reading of it. Now, this part, this reception part is something, and whether paratext really helps or hinders or has an ambivalent relationship with the reception of a text, those are aspects that I will highlight when I use the specific examples. But just to stick with Jeanette for a bit, I'm going to the next slide. Now, Jeanette uses various parameters to categorize paratext. But to simplify matters, he really starts with a kind of a questionnaire as to how do we define what is paratext and what is not a paratext. So, first of all, where is it published? The place of publication. Is it published in a magazine, in a serialized form? Is it published as a book? The location of publication, from which country is it published? Is it published from, let's say, India, England? Because several books will have different editions. Like, several books will have an American edition or an English edition. There would be an Irish edition. In case of, Swift's Gulliver's Travels, there was an Irish edition. There was an English edition. So, again, depending on how orthodox or conservative or unorthodox a country might be, naturally, certain things would be included, certain things might not be included, certain things would be excluded, and so on and so forth. So, and in fact, if I were to give an example about the impact of the location, if we recall the very, if we go back to Arthur Conan Doyle and talk about Sherlock Holmes, Sherlock Holmes really became a phenomenon in America before he kind of got recognized in England, and only after he kind of became quite a phenomenon in America, the English sort of sat up and took notice, and then of course the whole story with the Strand magazine started. So the place of publication becomes important. And in terms of serialization, Dickens's novels, pages and pages, are like tomes. But why are they tomes? Because remember, Dickens was publishing them in serials, in magazines. So it's like I'm sorry, people don't kill me for drawing this comparison, but if you talk about our modern day TV soaps, they have to end on a highlight. So naturally, you will have to have many, many highlight points. So it changes, therefore, the structure of the storytelling, the structure of the text. So in other words, paratext does influence text. Next is when. So this has several aspects. This has a historical aspect in terms of the date of publication, and consequently the cultural milieu in which a text is published, what was acceptable, what was not acceptable, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, how have things changed over the subsequent editions. But also this business of appearance and disappearance of prefaces, dedications, and other paratextual elements. So depending on when it is published, the author might decide that, okay, now I'm going to add another foreword to this work. Incidentally, in case of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the introduction was added to the third edition. So Frankenstein was first published in 1818. By the time it was 1831, the third edition of the novel was coming out, and for that Mary Shelley wrote an introduction. And incidentally, in 1818, there was a preface which was written by her husband, P.B. Shelley. Now, of course, eventually I'll talk about those two the paratextual documents and what we can derive and how it affects our reading of the text. So what I'm trying to say is material, or rather what Jeanette is saying, that depending on the time when a particular text is published, certain elements might be included or excluded, and that also affects the reading of texts. Next is, how is the text presented? And this includes typographical choice as well. I mean, just imagine if you are publishing a serious scholarly work and you're using that Comic Sans kind of a type, people are not going to take it seriously, right? On the other hand, if you, and I forget the name of the series, but there are those series of books which kind of make dense literary theories accessible for students. And there they use cartoons to demonstrate points. So there, I suppose that Comic Sans font would make sense. So once again, depending on what you're trying to do and how you are presenting the text, the reading changes. Now, under this, we also have what Jeanette calls the substantial aspect and the factual aspect of the text. So the factual aspects are, for example, sometimes just the name of the author, the sex of the author might affect our reading. And it was definitely a case during the 18th and 19th century. So when Frankenstein was first published, it was published anonymously. And nobody, of course, nobody knew Mary Shelley at that point in time, so nobody would have guessed. But people were horrified when they eventually discovered that not only was this such a scandalous book, it was written by a woman, a girl. How can it be? So sex often determines what you can write and what you cannot write. And we have, famous instances of George Eliot assuming a male name in order to get published. Because, especially in the 18th century, there were very, specific restrictions levied on women writers. You can only write domestic novels. You can only write, prudish things, didactic things, and so on and so forth. You can't write a racy novel and get away with it. Monk Lewis can, or Matthew Lewis, who wrote that very, very racy, almost bordering on pornographic novel called The Monk. Not that he didn't get a lot of flack for it, but imagine if he had been a woman in the 1790s and he had written something like that, he would probably have been lynched. So that, these very facts, the date of publication, the age of the author, and when we may say age, we don't just say historical period, but we also sometimes consider the actual age of the author. Like I just gave the instance of Mary Shelley. She, in her introduction to the third edition of Frankenstein, she says that, people have often questioned me, asking me, how can a young girl come up with this kind of a story? So the author's age also matters. The next point is from whom and to whom. So addressee and sender. And this, of course, has several subsections. Now, of course, I can't get into all of these subsections because that will, we'll be here all night. But the point is that there are certain times when authors will deliberately compose a preface. Sometimes the preface will be composed by the publisher. Sometimes it's a combination, combined effort. And at other times, prefaces may be written by a third party. Also, under this business of sender and addressee comes materials which are not strictly part of the book. So, for example, publishing puffs, when or announcement that a book is coming out. So, where are those announcements published? Is the announcement given in the newspaper, meant for the general public? Is it announced only maybe in a scholarly journal, which will automatically ensure a niche audience? Who are you trying to attract? And accordingly, where is it getting published? Also, in case of the prefaces and paratexts, sometimes the author will guide the reader to read a text in a particular manner in the prefatory material. Again, that is something that I will talk about with reference to Horus Walpole. So Sometimes they will do that. Sometimes the publisher will have his or her own agenda in presenting a text in a particular way, just in terms of, okay, should I mention the word a novel? That's the publisher's design. Or how will I design the cover? How will I design the title page? Again, those are part of what is called a paratext. And of course, as you know, you can understand from the way I'm speaking, all these elements definitely have a function. So paratext is also looked at by Jeanette from its functional perspective. So when he says functional perspective, he talks about the illocutionary force, and I'll just briefly kind of outline what he means. So he says that there are various messages are basically given by just the presence or absence of something. So, for example, an author may use a fancy pseudonym. Okay, sometimes it is used to hide the real identity of the author. Sometimes it is just used in a playful manner, in a satirical manner, which of course a text like Gulliver's Travels illustrates, because Swift was using or pretending that it was written by this character called Lemuel Gulliver, and he was trying to give flesh and blood to Lemuel Gulliver. But we also know that it's the text itself is extremely ironical, so it's very tongue-in-cheek. We are not meant to fall or take everything that Gulliver is saying at its face value. So there can be that kind of a play in terms of the authorial name or pseudonym. Then in terms of genre, as I just mentioned, sometimes genres can be specifically mentioned. Let's say, I don't know, The Accidental Prime Minister, a biography. Now, the moment you use the word biography, there are certain expectations that automatically churns in the reader's head. So accordingly, the text will be received. Secondly, history or memoir. Each of these categories have a different kind of a ramification for the reader. And incidentally, many of the works that we today read as novels, when they came out during the 18th century, they were not even called novels, because that word novel had a pejorative connotation. So, in fact, Samuel Richardson's famous work, Pamela, it came out as a sort of almost as a model book for teaching young girls how to write a letter. In fact, that is what Richardson was initially commissioned to do, and then subsequently that commission turned into a novel, what we call today a novel, but Richardson never called it a novel. Similarly, Fielding, if we look at Fielding's Tom Jones, Fielding's Tom Jones is called, let me give you the exact title from the cover page, the title page that is. Give me 1 second. And I don't know if you can see this. The history of Tom Jones, a foundling. So nowhere does it mention the word novel. It's a history. So once again, these terms become important and they have a function. And these are also, therefore, very much a part of the paratext, because this brings to another aspect of paratext, which is the performative power of the paratext, the ability to perform what they describe. That is, in the case with dedications and inscriptions and so on and so forth. So these are the functional aspects of paratext. Now, as you can see, all these sort of categories and subcategories do overlap and they do impact each other. So one can't necessarily be read without referring to the other, or without referring to, or without the ramifications leaking in between the lines, so to speak. Okay, I'm changing the slide. Okay, now the next thing that Gerard Genette does is that he further subdivides this idea of paratext into two broad categories: peritext and epitext. Now, what is peritext? Peritext is literally those elements which are part of the text. For example, dedication, or the title page, or the index, Or let's say in Milton's Paradise Lost, every book begins with a short argument summarizing what that book is going to be. These are all peritexts. Epitext are those aspects which are distanced from the text. So for example, maybe the author's interview prior to the publication of a particular work or subsequent to it. Or as I said, puff pieces, which are inserted in the newspapers. So these are the various what you call epitexts, because they are located outside the book. Now, even under epitext, he talks about two kinds of epitext. One is the private epitext, and I'm emphasizing it because I'll be sort of referring to it. So these can include everything, authorial correspondence, or the initial draft of a particular text, diaries, the pretext, as he says. And then there is a public dimension to the epitext, which, as I said, interviews or announcements or advertisements and so on and so forth. Okay, I'm changing slides here. Now, so Genet's book, that is Paratexts, is really a part of his larger interest in what he calls trans-textuality. And trans-textuality, as he defined in the introduction to his earlier book, Architext, is the textual transcendent, namely everything that brings it into relation, manifest or hidden with other texts. I call that trans-textuality. And as Nishi was just mentioning, texts are not just words written on a page. Texts can mean multiple things. So therefore, paratexts not only condition, but they also influence and therefore change the meaning and interpretation of texts. Now, as part of this trans-textuality that he is interested in, one aspect of trans-textuality, there are many other aspects, which of course I'll not discuss here. One aspect of trans-textuality is paratextuality. And this is something that he explores in three main works, of which Paratexts, which I'm talking about, is the last one. The earlier ones were Architext and Palimpsest. Okay, that's by way of information. I'm changing the slide now. Now, okay, let me now go into talking about paratexts using certain examples. And mind you, when I'm using these examples, I'll show you how all these various aspects of paratexts sort of mingle and influence one another and kind of come together to influence the impact of a particular work. So beginning with Frankenstein, as I told you, Frankenstein, when it was first published, it was published anonymously with the preface, which was written by P.B. Shelley, but it was not declared that it was written by P.B. Shelley. But even before it was published, Shelley really had a hard time finding a publisher to begin with, because nobody wanted to touch the novel with a barge pole, given its content. And why? Because, as William St. Clair in his famous book, Reading Nation, he said that, most of these novels, they were expensive, and circulating libraries will not want to buy them, because if the content was so unorthodox and scandalous during that time, there would be no takers. So why would they spend the money? So naturally, Shelley was having a very hard time until he narrowed down on this publisher called Lackington. And once again, remember, Lackington took up this novel to publish because, as St. Clair says, Lackington's publishing house specialized in magic, illegitimate supernatural, and horror. So it kind of falls in line with the usual things that are published. And in fact, St. Clair tells us that in the advertisement, in the original advertisement, Lackington actually mentioned certain works of supernatural which had come out of that publishing house. So once again, see the very advertisement, the very mention of other works published by this publisher, again puts the actual work, Frankenstein, in a specific category. Now, Next comes, and the categorization I'll talk about, come back later on when I talk about the prefaces. But also the format in which the work is published determines, the fate of the work. And this, you remember, goes back to that idea of the substantial aspect and the pragmatic aspect, as Jeanette calls it. So this particular novel was, according to St. Clair, published as a 3-volume piece. And it was, remember Frankenstein, if you see, it's a very slender novel. So in order to increase the actual volume of the pages, they actually, increase the line spacing so that they can come up with 3 volumes. And why? Because if you come up with 3 volumes, it will be more expensive, and therefore it will be more profitable for the circulating libraries to buy. So again, you see, it's a business decision, and yet it is affecting how the text itself is organized and structured, right? So volume 1, where does it end? Volume 2, where does it end? Volume 3, where does it end? So all of these will have to be then determined by the author. So this is how paratextual elements influence the actual writing of the text, division of the text, and interpretation of the text. Now, going back to this first point, as in the choice of publisher, and how does it relate to the preface that P.B. Shelley wrote for the 1818 edition. Now, in the preface to the 1818 edition, P.B. Shelley specifically mentions that the author was not weaving a mere tale of supernatural terrors. So in other words, lest you don't take it seriously, lest you don't take this work seriously, please do, because it's not just meant to thrill and horrify you. It has a deeper substance. And in order to underscore the fact that it has a deeper substance, it said that it delineates human nature. And it also referred to contemporary scientific experiments in order to make the claim that whatever you're going to read is plausible. It may not actually be happening in the world, but it's plausible because it's based on certain scientific experiments and their implications. So in other words, this is not a sort of a plaything. It is not to be taken lightly. It is to be taken seriously. And next, apart from this preface, the work was dedicated explicitly to William Godwin. Now, obviously, William Godwin, as the philosopher, as the Enlightenment philosopher, has a certain serious standing, and he also was known for his views, very, very kind of revolutionary views on social reform and political reform. So, immediately, the moment you are dedicating this novel to William Godwin, as St. Clair says, you're putting it in the category of serious literature. And you're putting it in the category or in the school of certain kinds of serious literature. And therefore, it is not to be taken lightly. It is to be contended with. So all of these things, mind you, are determined by the preface, which is the paratext. You have not even got to the text. And incidentally, if you remember, Frankenstein, the very title page, begins with a quotation from Milton's Paradise Lost. Once again, Paradise Lost, a very, very, it's almost like sacred. It's an epic. It's the first English epic, or the earliest English epic. And Milton, of course, being a legend, being a sort of almost godlike figure. So if you're quoting from Milton and putting it on the title page, naturally, people are going to be intrigued and also perhaps wonder, okay, maybe this is not rubbish. Like we, for example, when we watch a trailer and we watch an actor who has some credibility as opposed to maybe a big movie star who doesn't. So immediately when you watch that actor, you're like, oh, okay, well, this movie has Nasiruddin Shah, so it can't be too bad. Okay, let me go. So it's a similar kind of impact. And finally, the sex of the writer also matters here, because P.B. Shelley, I don't know if it was inadvertent or deliberate, but he uses the pronoun his therefore giving the impression that this is written by a man. So as I said, given the kind of prejudice or rather restrictions that women writers had, obviously this would, perhaps lessen the blow, so to speak. But the point is that despite Shelley's, elaborate views, the blow wasn't really lessened, because some of the critics were really, really vicious, and one of them was Lackington from Quarterly Review. And just a minute, if I can read out some of it. I know I don't have the time to read out the whole of it, but if you just bear with me. So Lackington in Quarterly Review says, it is piously dedicated, that is this novel, it is piously dedicated to Mr. Godwin and is written in the spirit the spirit of the school. The dreams of insanity are embodied in the strong and striking language of the insane, and the author, notwithstanding the rationality of the preface, often leaves us in doubt whether he is not as mad as his hero. So in spite of that, all the prefatory material which can control the interpretation of the text, there you go. This is what the interpretation. This is kind of interpretation. This is the kind of reaction you get. And Lackington also called it a tissue of horrible and disgusting absurdity. In spite of all the references to scientific experiments, plausibility, it becomes a horrible and disgusting absurdity. There you go. So, as I said, this brings us into the question as to the effectiveness of paratextual elements. In other words, do paratextual elements really give the author the power to control the text that is being put out there, or even the publisher to control the text that is put out there? Or does it backfire? Does it become a double-edged sword? So it's a very ambivalent relation that we have between text and paratext over here. Next, we come to the 1831 preface by Mary Shelley. And if you juxtapose it with the actually preface, it's the introduction that Mary Shelley writes to the third edition. But if we juxtapose this, the claims that are being made in this introduction as opposed to P.B. Shelley's preface, we will approach the novel, even without reading the first chapter, our very approach is going to be different. Because what P.B. Shelley was emphasizing in the preface was that this work is going to be a sort of a social critique. Its design is reformatory. It is giving you certain supernatural elements, but that's not really the focus of it, or that's not really the point of it. It is meant to be a sort of reformatory novel in the line of perhaps the Jacobin novels. Mary Shelley, on the other hand, she does two things. First of all, she answers the query, how can a girl write this? And a young girl. And in order to do that, she recounts that famous dream that she had when there, as many of you know, that Frankenstein was born out of this competition to write a ghost story. And only Mary Shelley ultimately finished her novel. And then there was a short story called The Vampire that came out of this. But the point is that everybody was excited. Everybody meaning Lord Byron, P.B. Shelley, Byron's Dr. Polidori, and Mary Shelley. Everybody was excited, and they wanted to write ghost stories. So Mary Shelley wasn't being able to come up with ideas. And then suddenly, one day she fell asleep and she dreamed, and that dream became the germ of Frankenstein. And that dream is featured, so to speak, in the novel, where the monster first comes to life and parts the curtain, the bed curtain of Frankenstein, and Frankenstein is horrified by his own creation. Now, the moment Mary Shelley is drawing your attention to this genesis of the novel, she is squarely putting the novel in the category of the supernatural, or more specifically, the category of the Gothic. Now, the approach to reading a Gothic novel or a supernatural text will be very different to reading a novel which is something that is like Caleb Williams, Mary Shelley's father, Godwin's novel Caleb Williams, where he talked about Caleb Williams as a sort of fictitious rendition of his political and sociological theory of reform. That's a philosophical work. Now, does that mean Frankenstein is not philosophical? Does it not have elements of philosophy? Of course it does. But the point is that this introduction by Mary Shelley, which is a paratext, colors our eye of interpreting the text. Okay, the next instance that I want to talk about is the instance of Horus Walpole. And this is extremely interesting because Horus Walpole, as many of you might know, is credited to with being the writer of the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto. But if we go back to the story of the composition and publication, most importantly the publication of The Castle of Otranto, which was published in late December 1684, early 1765. When it was first published, it was published as Castle of Otranto. The title page read, Castle of Otranto, a story translated by William Marshall Gentleman from the original Italian of Onufrio Muralto, canon of the Church of St. Nicholas at Otranto. Now, clearly this kind of a title page will tell you, oh my God, so this is a story that is written in the medieval ages. As if you had any doubt, or as if you would doubt, Horus Walpole also appended a preface which says, look people, this William Marshall guy found the story in a church, and now he's translating it. And then there is this elaborate preface which basically asks you to read this novel in a particular way, because it is replete, of course, with what we today would call absurd supernatural elements. There are instructions like miracles, visions, necromancy, dreams, and other preternatural events are exploded now even from romances. But this was not the case when our author wrote, much less when the story itself is supposed to have happened. So in other words, be generous, be kind to the supernatural elements, because it's just a sign of their times. But see what is happening. It's kind of a double camouflage here. Not only is Horus Walpole not using his own name, he is inventing a fictive translator and a translation of some other medieval Gothic story. So it's kind of, thrice removed from reality, if you will. I'm misquoting Plato here. So therefore, you see how many stages of fabrication there are. And why is there this fabrication? Why did Horus Walpole feel the need to fabricate? Because of his standing as an author at that point in time. Horus Walpole, mind you, not only was he the son of the then Prime Minister Robert Walpole and an aristocrat, he himself had, been writing on art. So he had been an art critic. He had his own printing press. He was publishing anthologies of poems by Thomas Gray. So he had a certain seriousness and a certain profile, which might very well be destroyed if he wrote a so-called supernatural story in an age of enlightenment. And in fact, that is exactly what happened by the time the second edition was published. Because what happened was, when the first edition was published and it sold like hotcakes, then Walpole kind of gained some confidence and said, okay, now let me come out with the truth. And in the second preface, he claimed, he confessed that, yes, I was the author and I composed this work because I wanted to basically conduct a literary experiment where elements of what he calls the ancient romance and the modern romance, by modern romance he largely means novels, these two, the best of both these worlds, I have tried to bring together. And that is why I've composed this work. And incidentally, remember what I told you about the title page of the first edition? It just mentioned a story. In the second edition, Walpole added the word a Gothic story, and the rest is history, right? Because this is supposed to have inspired then the whole subgenre of the Gothic novel. But what is extremely interesting is then what and how do we interpret the word Gothic? Because this Gothic story has actually nothing Gothic in it in that sense. because it doesn't deal with the Goths, the tribes who marauded the Roman Empire. It doesn't even deal with technically Gothic architecture. Yes, it is set in a medieval castle with, subterranean passages and abbeys and dark corners and so on and so forth. But what does this word Gothic really mean? And therefore, there came various definitions that, if you open M.H. Abrams, we could say a Gothic story is a supernatural story set in medieval times. Very vague definition, because it gets very confusing as you read the subsequent Gothic novels and the way it evolves. But the plus side of it, and this is something that the critic Gerald Hogel points out, that because it did not kind of prescribe in stone what a Gothic story was. In other words, because Horus Walpole fabricated, that is why the Gothic as a genre became a sort of vacuum which could encompass the various anxieties and fears and desires of all the ages, and therefore Gothic as a genre survived. So the point is, what do the two prefaces, that is the two paratextual elements of Horus Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, bring to forth? It brings to forth the issue of genre. In fact, it started a new genre. It brings to forth the issue of pseudonym and how one can use it and what can be the ramifications. It also brings in the question of authorial identity, because once Walpole confessed that he was the author, critics were vicious, and at times they attacked the very elements of the novel that they had earlier praised. They were vicious. They were like, in this age of enlightenment and reasoning, you come up with all this vulgar rubbish, this vulgar trash. How dare you? Okay. So once again, it is the prefatory material, or rather the paratextual material, which is creating all this ruckus. Next, I go to the epi text. So as if you remember, epi text constitutes of those elements which are not technically and physically part of the actual novel, but they constitute of materials that are outside the actual text, which means, it can be advertisements, it could be letters that were, that are exchanged between publisher and author, or between personal friends of the author, and so on and so forth. And it can be public, it can be, it can be personal. It can be interviews that are made public. It can be personal letters where an author discusses a particular work, and so on and so forth. So the instance that I'm going to talk about is a personal letter that Horus Walpole wrote about the composition of The Castle of Otranto. It was written to Reverend William Cole on March 1965. And here, Walpole says how he had composed The Castle of Otranto. He says, I had time to write but a short note with The Castle of Otranto, and so on and so forth. You will even have found some traits to put you in the mind. Okay. So he says, I was going to dine abroad. Your partiality to me and Strawberry Hill, by the way, was the Gothic castle that, or the Gothic house that Walpole built for himself. I hope inclined you to excuse the wildness of the story. You will even have found some traits to put you in the mind of this place. When you read of the picture quitting its panel, did you recollect the portrait of Lord Falkland, all in white, in my gallery? Still, shall I even confess to you what the origin of this romance? I waked one morning in the beginning of last June from a dream, of which, as all I could recover was that I had thought myself in an ancient castle, a very natural dream for a head filled like mine with Gothic story. That on the uppermost banister of a giant staircase, I saw a gigantic hand in armor. In the evening, I sat down and began to write, without knowing in the least what I intended to say or relate. The work grew on my hands, and I grew fond of it. In short, I was so engrossed by my tale, which I completed in less than 2 months, that one evening I wrote from the time I had drunk my tea, about 6 o'clock, till half an hour after 1 in the morning, when my hand and fingers were so weary that I could not hold the pen to finish the sentence. So, if you read this account of the novel, you would say, oh, so this is a very romantic account. So he just dreamt, dreamt about this giant hand being placed on the banister because of the ambience in which he's living, which is a castle anyway, which he has built up. And therefore it is, to use Wordsworth's, phrase, as a spontaneous overflow, right? So he's just writing it. It's coming naturally. It's not deliberate. But if you contrast it to the second preface clearly tells you, no, man, I am going in for a deliberate literary experiment. Well, then how do we read it? Again, that opens up a whole array or a whole range and area of interpretation for the text. And once again, why? Because we are reading it in context of the paratext, in this case, the epitext. Okay, I will just go briefly. I know I'm probably way over time. Am I way over time? Sir?
Yeah, I think you can continue for some few more minutes, maybe.
Okay.
5 minutes.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, sir. Okay, so the final example that I have of an epitext is that of Gulliver's Travels. Now, the epitext of Gulliver's Travels will be very, very interesting. The epitext of Gulliver's Travels would be extremely, extremely interesting because, again, there is a lot of fabrication and playing going on. First of all, the 1726 edition of Gulliver's Travels starts with a letter, and give me 1 second. It starts with the publisher to the reader. And this publisher happens to be, or claims to be, Gulliver's cousin, William Simpson. Now, there are several aspects to this letter. First and foremost, it says that Gulliver himself had given permission to publish his account. Secondly, Gulliver is the epitome of truth. He never lies. And this particular piece of, this particular account, this travel account, it says, has an air of truth apparent through the whole. And the style is very plain and simple. And the only fault I find is that the author, after the manner of travelers, is a little too circumstantial. So the publisher says that because he had included too many details, I have just chopped a few of those, because that would be boring for the reader. So that is the extent of editing that he admits to. And secondly, what is the intention or the agenda of the work? It is supposed to meant for better entertainment of our young noblemen than the common scribbles of politics and party. So it's nothing more than a mere entertainment. Now, very interestingly, what happens is when the Irish edition of Gulliver's Travels comes out, it also comes appended with a letter from Captain Gulliver to his cousin Simpson. And in this letter, man, Gulliver just thrashes Simpson. He says, first of all, when did I give you the permission to publish my work? In fact, it only got published because you people pestered me and pestered me and pestered me. And secondly, I thought that if this work was published, it would improve the yahoos, that is his terms for the human race, of course. The horrible yahoos would be reformed by my work. But look, it's already been 3 months and there is no sign of reformation. I knew the moment, I knew that it was going to be hopeless to publish a work like this, because the yahoos are completely irredeemable creatures. So he says, and I'm reading out from this letter, yahoos, pray bring to your mind how often I desired you to consider, when you insisted on the motive of public good, that the yahoos were a species of animals utterly incapable of amendment by precepts or examples. So what does this say? Gulliver therefore implicitly claims that Simpson had told him, publish this in order to reform society for public good. Yet, if you read the account of the publisher to the reader, Simpson says it is meant for entertainment, which is the proper agenda. And this discrepancy furthers Swift's larger satirical intention. His larger satirical intention, of course, was to parody and therefore laugh at some of the excesses and absurdities of the travel accounts, among other things, of course. So in this case, you see how these epi texts, which are part of the paratexts, are playing sort of into Swift's larger satirical agenda. And then finally, one more point that I want to make here, which is that in this particular letter, Gulliver also really gets angry because he says that the printer has completely, completely distorted my text so much so that I can hardly recognize my own work. And he says, I find it likewise that your printer has been so careless as to confound the times and mistake the dates of my several voyages and returns, neither assigning the true year or the true month or the day of the month. And I hear the original manuscript is all destroyed since the publication of my book. Neither have I any copy left. However, I have sent you some corrections, which you may insert if ever there should be a second edition. And yet I cannot stand to them, but shall leave the matter to my judicious and candid readers to adjust it as they please. So, and he says, I remember each return to my own country, their own dialect, so altered that, sorry. Okay, never mind, I don't have to read this. So once again, what do we see here? We see that the whole idea of text begins to acquire a material dimension, and a material dimension which can have actual pertinent consequences for the writer. So Gulliver's Travels is a very interesting novel, which both kind of shows us how Swift can control his material to get what he wants in terms of reaction, and also show us how dangerous a text can become when it goes out of the writer's control. Because Gulliver says that not only has it been, completely distorted out of its original shape, he says, I also find that there are a lot of keys and libels and reflections and memoirs and second parts that are being written, and all of these are being attributed, being connected to my text, and therefore it is again, giving me a certain identity as an author, which I absolutely detest. And it says for some of them will not be, and some of the keys and reflections and memoirs will not even allow me to be the author of my own travels, and others make me author of books to which I'm wholly a stranger. So once again, you see the profile of the author, the authorial identity comes into question because of certain material things that are happening. Again, paratext and text interacting. So transition and transaction, as Jeanette had said. Paratext, therefore, will have to be read as transition and transaction. And so I will end with these two ideas that I have. So in other words, why should we concentrate, or why should we even consider paying attention to the paratextual elements? Because out of many things, the 2 points that it can highlight are the materiality of the text and its implications, and authorial identity. Who or what is the author? And I'm not getting into Foucault. I'll just leave it for the question answer session if anybody wants to bring it up. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, MRC. It was wonderful hearing to both the speakers on texts and paratexts. As we were hearing, I'm sure there have been a few questions, queries in our mind, and it's now time for the question answer session. I would like to open up the session by inviting Professor Dhar to offer his remarks. Sir, if you could please.
Well, okay. First of all, this was a very stimulating session because this was a kind of an engagement between a creative writer and someone who's looking more theoretically at the whole notion of texts and paratexts. I think it was stimulating, it was enlightening, and it was certainly satisfying at the end of the year. And as you said, it leaves us with thoughts, impressions, ideas that we're going to use and look forward to in the future, in the next year. Nishi, I was wondering about your presentation, which once again was solidly grounded on your own experiences as a writer, both of fiction as well as non-fiction, that is, criticism in a sense. I was wondering, you see, is there a distinction that you could draw between, say, literary, which is an imaginative creation, and your other aspect, which is that of an academic? You're producing text in both on both accounts. Now, is there any difference that you could that you feel, perceive, not only imagine but experience as you're writing these?
Yeah, thank you so much, Shubhida. Yes, I think there is a difference because I think when I'm approaching an academic work, I mean, there are readings for both. I mean, but there are different. I mean, when I'm writing a creative work, the kind of reading that I do is different. It doesn't have anything to do with the work per se, or it doesn't influence my work per se. But when I am doing an academic kind of a work, I have a lot of other works that I refer to, lot of and lot of other paratext, if I may use that word, that I look into. So yes, they're very different. I think they're very, very different when it comes to writing these two kind of works. And I don't find there is a lot of similarity between the similarities just because I'm writing them both, but there is definitely a lot of difference. For instance, when I'm writing a critical academic work, I am more focused in my approach. I mean, I have a definite kind of a hypothesis which I am addressing. I have definite texts which I am looking up, and the kind of citations, the kind of references that I'm using, the kind of intertextuality that I'm using there is very, very different from the kind of writing that I'm doing, which is non-academic. I mean, the non-academic one, I think there is no specific, I don't know if I could use the word agenda when I'm writing it. Or say I don't have a distinct, unless of course someone tells me to write, someone asks me to write on a particular thing or a particular subject or an idea. Otherwise, I'm more or less, I'm left to my own kind of stirrings, my own kind of thoughts, my own kind of ruminations when I'm doing that. But when I'm doing the academic kind of thing, I think I'm much more, I don't want to use the word focus, but I think there's a different thought process when I'm doing the academic one. And there are times, when I'm doing both simultaneously. So, and then I find straddling these two worlds a bit difficult. So because, when I'm doing academic work, it's mostly you are, writing to deadlines. So I find it, more, I prefer to concentrate on the academic work when I'm doing and try not to work on my creative writing at that point of time, because it kind of disturbs the flow of idea. But yes, there is a lot of difference between the two.
All right. Thank you. I have not a question really, but just a suggestion and a curiosity, which I like Dr. Madhusundara Chaudhary to address, if I may, and that is, you see, would you think that this late 20th century preoccupation with the interstices of literature, the minor issues, the elements which are not on the surface, for example, the whole notion of paratextuality, would you see this amounts to a kind of a hair splitting, something that we can perhaps do without? What's your personal view on that?
Yeah, sir, I would actually say no, it is not hair splitting, because that's what I was trying to demonstrate with the help of the examples. As we know that we have come a long way from the so-called formalist view where the text is the text is the god and nothing else. But as I was mentioning, with reference to whether it's Frankenstein, whether it's Gulliver's Travels, Frankenstein, first and foremost, if we don't take into consider these paratexts, we ignore a very important question, which is the agency of the female author in the early 19th century. Because in fact, if I may add, there are, and I forget the name of, forget the scholar who had done this research, but she had actually compared the manuscripts of Frankenstein and where P.B. Shelley suggested certain changes and what changes Mary Shelley made to the text. And incidentally, one of the things that P.B. Shelley had said, one change that P.B. Shelley had made in the last sentence kind of made the monster's demise quite a finality. That, you see him burning. But instead, Mary Shelley very pertinently ends the novel with the line that he disappeared in distance. He disappeared in a distance. Now, the moment she says disappeared into the distance, yes, the monster has said that I'm going to go and commit suicide, but we don't know whether it's actually going to happen. In other words, she leaves it open. And that, according to me, is a far more evocative way of ending the novel. But if she had followed Shelley's suggestion and given it a final closure, then we would read it very differently. But again, if we were not interested in the paratexts, or if we had not taken into account the paratexts, these considerations would not come to forth. Secondly, even in case of Horus Walpole, we can't read Horus Walpole without reading the two prefaces, which are very much paratextual. And also the critics' reaction. If I had spoken about this in one of my earlier lectures, that when the novel came out as supposed translation of an 18th century gentleman, there was anger that, how can a person from this century write like this? But the moment Horace Walpole's name came out, all hell broke loose, because he had a certain profiling, and in fact, he didn't even publish this novel, even though he had his own printing press, Strawberry Hill, because Strawberry Hill was associated with much more credible and serious work. And so he didn't risk publishing it from Strawberry Hill. So all these considerations, I think they do bear, they do bear down on our reading of the text.
Could I just add to what Shubhida was asking me about the academic work and the creative work? I think when I'm doing the academic kind of writing, the paratexts play a very, very important role as well, which they don't when unless of course I am writing for a specific, I've been asked to write for something specific where I have that in mind. Otherwise, I'm writing because I feel the urge for writing in the case of the creative thing. And the paratextual part comes in when I am thinking of when I've already approached a publisher, and then the publisher begins to talk about various things. But when I'm doing an academic writing, the paratext does play a very, very important role.
Ma'am, if I can ask you a question.
Please, MRC, I think you can.
Yeah, just one curiosity is just, ma'am, when you're doing your creative writing, do you have any kind of briefing from the publisher? In other words, doesn't the paratext come in as to how you're going to position it, especially in this day and age when all these fancy bookshops have sections and subsections of categorization? Do you ever face any kind of feedback or suggestion or pressure from the publisher when you're writing creatively?
No, not when I'm writing creatively, but when the publishing bit happens, when my manuscript is ready and the publisher is agreed, that is when a lot of influence and that depends on the publisher as well. So that is when it comes in, not when I am writing per se. Not in the initial part of it. There, I don't have any kind of intervention because I'm doing it because, I feel writing is very cathartic, particularly since the pandemic, it's become even more. That's something that allows me to hold on to things as we're moving through these very difficult times. But when the publishers agreed to publish the manuscript, that is when, the interventions are there. Yeah. Otherwise, before that, I haven't till now. I don't know how it's going to be later on, but till now it hasn't happened. So when the manuscript is there, then yes.
That was a very stimulating discussion between all three of you. I am tempted to add something, and I find our colleague Sudesha is also here. I think she will also join me. You see, in the classical Indian tradition, the text is considered to be supreme because it's so, ancient that we don't really know what was going on in the author's mind, and there is no tradition where the author has left something behind for the readers. But what is interesting is, I would definitely like to know when somebody like a scholar like Shayana or a poet like Goswami Tulsidas was writing, what was he thinking when he was composing in Hindustani? What was he thinking? There was another scholar from Bengal who wrote a wonderful commentary on Gita, and it was said of him by his students and contemporary scholars that what he knew, Saraswati knew, but what Saraswati knew, the goddess of learning, he alone knew. His name was incidentally was Madhusudan Saraswati. So that is quite interesting, and there are these often things about the authors. There two comes to my mind. One is the great Sanskrit author Bana. Another is obviously we are all aware of Vyasa, Veda Vyasa. So about both, it is said Vyaso Chishtam Jagat Sarvam or Bano Chishtam Jagat Sarvam. Whatever they have written is what the universe is all about. Now, there is nothing more in the universe that they have not written. There's nothing else. So this, I don't know if somebody has attempted to look at, because essentially the authors are not speaking, but someone contemporary is speaking, whether these thoughts could be, considered and a tradition could be built upon in the pre-modern times. Anyway, that was just a comment and observation which I thought, and I don't know how meaningful it is, but still we'll see some of our colleagues and many of our students are here. If they have a question or they need some clarification, I think this is the right time to ask.
Prabal, I just want to chip in for a second, if I may. And this is an extended discussion. We'll continue later on, maybe over a pot of tea. That is, of course, you see, what you're really talking about is related to the concept of itihasa, that which was written. And so maybe, there could be a link to what you were suggesting and to what I'm suggesting right now, that, the whole notion of writing, inscription, tradition, reception, these are issues that could be focused on to make perhaps adjustments to the Western modes of looking at the similar concepts. But that's going to take an extended session. So I think let's not go into that. But if our colleagues, the students here, guests, anyone else have any observation, and please take over on that.
Yes, Prashanta, please go ahead. Anyone up with a question or? Yeah, we have a question from one of our students, MA students, Anam. Yeah, you may please ask. You can unmute yourself and ask. Is there a problem with
Could they switch over to a message or a chat box?
I'm not sure if she can access the chat box. Can Anam?
No,
Perhaps,
they cannot. They cannot.
So
access.
they can perhaps WhatsApp you the question and then you can.
A circuitous paratextual route.
No, there has not been any text so far.
Okay.
Okay. Then on that note, I think we will just conclude today with warm wishes for a very happy and prosperous new year to our two distinguished speakers of the day, Dr. Nishi Pulgorta and Dr. Madhuchanda Roy Chaudhary. And a big thank you to all the participating students and the faculty from the Department of English, Sister Nivedita University. A big thank you to all of you, and also wishes for a very happy and prosperous new year ahead. A new year which we think will hopefully usher in the end of the pandemic. Okay, and will hopefully not make things difficult for us. Now, before we formally close for the day, I would like to offer a formal vote of thanks. In a university like Sister Nivedita University, every department receives a lot of encouragement from the management, and it is one of the pillars of strength that keeps the department running and helps us in organizing programs like this. At the outset, I would like to thank the two distinguished speakers of the day for having painstakingly prepared for today's sessions. You have heard both the presentations, and you can imagine how much of time, work, reading have gone together to put this through. We thank both of them for their time and for sharing their thoughts with us. Thank you, Dr. Pulgorta, and thank you, Dr. Roy Chaudhary. A warm thanks to our mentor and advisor, Professor Dr. Shubir Kumar Dhar. He has been the brain behind all our academic activities and extended academic activities. Thank you, sir, for being there and guiding us, being the torch bearer of the department. And thanks to all our wonderful students for having made it to this session today evening. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening and a very happy new year to all of you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful being part of the evening. Best wishes to all.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, sir.
Okay, we will end on that note. And once again, in the new year, Destiny will be back once again with a bang. And we have several exciting programs lined up for you. Do join in, be a part of our extended family. And as you understand, there's a lot of hard work that goes behind the scenes. And with Probal right in front, with people like Monikin Kinibasu supporting us, encouraging us, helping us, including setting up this meeting, and our other faculty members like Dr. Roy Chaudhary, Dr. Prashanta Ghoshal, Shudesha Das, who else? Deep Dr. Mitro, Shantodeep Chatterjee, who missed out.
Kathakali is also here.
Kathakali Sengupta, and
Yeah, I think they are all here.
Okay, so all the amazing people in Desneo, because you see Desneo is a very new place. The university itself is a very new university, but I think we have been able to make an impression, leave a mark on active academics in Kolkata and in this part of India. And this can be done only because you see of the enthusiasm of everyone concerned, including you, the many people who joined the debate today. We hope to have you back with us. And so, as Dr. Roy Chaudhary had said, I mean, the male Dr. Roy Chaudhary had said, Paratexts once again. Goodbye and good night for now. Keep well, everyone. Bye.
Good night, sir. Good night, everybody.